Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we are reading issue number 120, and this is a very special issue because Hellblazer, the series, turns officially 10 years old in this issue. So it's a little oversized, and also it's got a bit of a different story going on in it. But before we get into that, just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. Last time we saw John very worried that he was going to get in trouble with Danny because she had gone out of town and asked John to watch her apartment, including her goldfish. And apparently John doesn't know how to feed goldfish, so he overfed them and they died. And of course he woke up to this the day that she was coming home, so he had to figure out a quick solution. He stopped by a pet store. The guy was not really any help, but he did sell him some fish that he told John could color with a pen to make them look like the fish she had. But that's kind of like the background story, because as John walks away from the pet store, all of a sudden he gets like a premonition that something bad's going to happen, specifically with a plane that was coming in at the airport. And throughout this issue, there had been like intercutting of various accidents throughout history, like the Titanic or the Hindenburg or other things like that. And the comic was proposing the idea that maybe all of these events are related through time somehow, like the Hindenburg created a ripple in time that ended up translating to this plane crash that was about to happen. And this premonition that John was having was so intense that he actually astral projected into the plane, and his spirit went through all the events of the crash, from, getting bumpy to the actual hitting of the ground. We cut to John just standing there looking up at the sky, and there is no plane. So it seems maybe he was getting a premonition for something that was going to happen but hadn't happened yet. But it was still, I guess, in the zeitgeist of time that John could feel. So first things first, with issue 120, we got the cover. We see John is in some sort of bar. There are demons in the background drinking, and he's looking straight out at us, and he's giving us the cheers motion with his pint. And we see on his trench coat that he has a green button that says 10 today. And like I said, that's because today in this issue, Hellblazer the series is turning 10. And as we turn to the first page, we see it's raining outside, it's nighttime, and we're in front of a pub, and there's lights on the inside, and we can see people in there. And as we get closer to the front door, we see two men come out. One of them is Muppet, and he looks right at us and he says, "Blimey, look what the cat dragged in. You all right then?" But there's no text that answers him. And then we get a panel that kind of pushes past Muppet, and we see there are two men inside the bar talking. One of them is Straff, and the other is a shadowy figure. And the shadowy figure is saying, "So I asked Dylan, what'd be harder to fuck?" And he says, "How about an armadillo?" And I says, "Can you draw an armadillo?" But we can't see this gentleman's face. Like I said, he's kind of in shadow, and Straff just looks kind of intrigued by whatever he's saying. Then we see a hand reach out and say, "Oi, over here." And as we walk past Straff towards the hand, we see it is John Constantine sitting at the bar, and he looks right at us and he says, "About bleeding time. Took you long enough, didn't it?" If you notice, all the interactions that have been on the page so far, someone has been looking directly at us as the reader. And that is the conceit of this issue. We are actually in this issue as a character, and we're hanging out with John and his friends, and also people who have written John and drawn John, because the man who was talking to Straff about Dylan drawing an armadillo is supposed to be Garth Ennis, and of course he's referencing Steve Dillon, who was the artist for most of the Hellblazer run he wrote. So as we stand with John at the bar, he turns to the bartender and says, "The usual, eh, Barry? Cheers, mate." And Barry replies, "Coming up, John." Then we see a man standing behind John turn, and he looks right at us and he says, "Christ, you still coming in this dump then? I'd have bloody surrendered by now." And this gentleman, I believe, is supposed to be Sean Phillips, who I forgot to say in the beginning with the cover, this is written by Paul Jenkins and drawn by Sean Phillips. So he's drawn himself into the comic. And there's a man standing next to Sean Phillips, who I believe is supposed to be Steve Dillon, and he looks at us and says, "Must be a fan of suspect stories and dubious accomplishments." Then Sean looks at John and says, "Or a glutton for punishment." And John replies, "Ha bloody ha. You two been practicing?" And then he turns to us and continues saying, "This profound insight from a pair of arseholes who do funny books for a living, eh? I ask you." And then he holds up a pint to us and says, "Here you are, the usual." And then he turns away from the bar and begins to walk, and he looks back at us and says, "Come on, let's go and sit down." And as he moves past some people, once again, these are all people who have written, drawn, or worked on Hellblazer in some way. So we see Straff is talking to one of those men, and he's saying, "So if you Yanks are so brilliant at football now, how come you lost to El Salvador, eh?" And the man he's talking to doesn't know what to say. Then we see, as John pushes past a couple other people, a man in a leather jacket is saying to a man in glasses, "All right if I put in for a check on Friday?" And the man with glasses replies, "Again?" And I'm assuming this is a writer or an artist talking to their editor, I guess, to see if they can get paid on Friday. But we move away from them before we hear any answers. And we follow John to a booth where John sits down and he pulls out a chair for us and he says, "Do you know what this is? It's our 10th bloody anniversary. Here, look, grab it before someone else nicks it." And then we sit down in the chair next to John and he says, "Marvelous, eh? I mean, 10 years coming in here every month like fucking clockwork. Me telling stories and you listening. And you know what's weird?" And then he looks right at us and he says, "Having an existential crisis in the middle of a boozer. That's what's weird." And we see on this page that the name of this issue is Desperately Seeking Something. And John pulls out a cigarette and he lights it, and he continues saying to us, "Look, I realize it's a naff feeling sorry for yourself after a few pints. But it's this place, isn't it? Sometimes I feel like I live in here." Then John kind of nods over to a man in silhouette sitting in front of a window, and I believe this is supposed to be Alan Moore, who, if you don't know, created John Constantine in the pages of Swamp Thing. I believe it's issue 37 of the saga of Swamp Thing. So John doesn't look at him, but he just kind of coolly nods over so that we look at him, and then John says to us, "You see him over there? Old mate of mine, from before I was even a player. Introduced me to a lot of people, he did, back when I was a nobody. But him, he was full of clever ideas. Got me involved in a lot of mad shit. Next thing I know, I'm knee-deep with the Sodden Cabbage Club. My life's been a bloody mess ever since." And the Cabbage Club that John is referring to is, of course, Swamp Thing and his family. And then John looks down kind of sad and says, "Ah, well, those were the days, eh? We've dropped out of touch a bit since then. I mean, we run into each other from time to time, but nothing much of consequence. Still, you know?" And then John turns to Alan Moore and he lifts his pint, and Alan lifts his back, and John says, "Cheers, man." Then John downs his pint and turns to us and says, "Tell you what, instead of me prating on about my dastardly deeds, let's get out of here for a change, eh? There's something I want to show you." And as John stands up, we must be giving a confused face because he looks at us and says, "Yeah, I know, it's a bit different. You'll just have to trust me, won't you? Follow me." So we do. We follow John as he walks through the bar, and as he's about to exit, we see another man who's standing just next to the door, and we catch his eye, and I believe this is supposed to be the writer, Paul Jenkins. And Paul gets very serious as we pass him, and he says very foreboding, "You be bloody careful out there with him, all right?" And as we follow John out of the front door, he says to us, "Hurry up, first stop's just around the corner." But as we walk outside, we see Rich and Michelle walking up to the pub, and they see John and us, and Rich says, "Yoicks! Tally-ho! It's the Tall Tale Club!" And Michelle looks at John and asks, "What are you two up to then?" And she comes over and gives us a hug, and she continues saying, "Cor, this bleeding weather, you must be mental coming out in this rain." And then Rich turns to John and asks, "You see my little brother in there, Conch?" And John answers, "He's up at the jukebox, trying to wrestle more dosh out of his editor." So Rich and Michelle walk inside, and as Michelle enters, she turns to us and says, "Yeah, well, see you back in there later then, eh?" And then John, who's lighting a cigarette, says, "Yeah, in a while." Then we turn the page, and we cut to the place where John was wanting to show us, and it is a magic shop called Archie Fine's Magic and Tricks. And John says, "Here, Archie Fine's Trick Shop. Best in London, if you ask me. I must have told you about this place, right?" "Nah, probably not." Then John goes over to the door and begins to knock, and he continues talking to us, saying, "We have to pop in here for a sec. Archie's a good lad, but a bit strange. Nothing you should worry about." But then he turns to us and he points a finger and he says, "Just don't do anything stupid, right?" Then John drops his cigarette and steps on it, and then the door opens and we're greeted by Archie Fine, who looks at John and says, "Well, well, if it isn't John Constantine. I thought you were bloody dead or something." And as he invites us in, we walk up the stairs, and as Archie gets to the top of the second floor, Artie turns and points down at us and says to John, And I see you've brought the poor soul who puts up with all your stories. Must be as patient as a saint, or mad as a hatter. And John replies sarcastically, Christ, Archie, I haven't heard that joke in at least a minute. And Archie seems a little offended by this, but he continues talking to John, saying, Well, I have to get my licks in while I can. It's been quiet round here since you abruptly passed away, John. And John replies, Just a vicious rumor, Arch. Listen, is the phone still in the back room, mate? I need to make a call. And as John walks towards the back room, Archie smiles as he watches him walk away, and then he casually leans against the wall and says, Help yourself, John. You ought to know your way around here by now. Unless you've forgotten, that is. That's right, down the hallway. That's it. Then as John closes the door to the back room, Archie says to us, He's gone. Listen to me, and listen carefully. And then he turns to us with fear in his eyes and he says, You must believe me. You're in terrible danger. And then he rushes past us over to a table with a carrot on it and a small guillotine. And Archie continues saying to us, Don't argue with me now. Just hear me out, okay? I can only guess what he's been telling you about me, if he's told you anything at all. He's putting you right in the bloody firing line bringing you out here. You're not the first, you know. And then Archie picks up the carrots and the guillotine and he holds them out to us and he says, God, you have no idea what I'm talking about, do you? Look, see this? It's obviously a magic trick. A simple illusion. And then Archie snaps the carrot in half, and he continues saying, You know that, and I know that. But Constantine, he thinks magic's real. Then Archie begins to tell us a story, and we get some flashback panels of when Archie first met John. So we get a younger John who's working at a casino, it looks, and Archie narrates saying, I knew him from the first, soon after he arrived in London from up north. We worked together in this awful bloody mafia-run casino in Soho. Cracking good caper for an old stage magician like me, mind you. I used to palm cards at the blackjack table. And we see a younger Archie watching young John, who is the dealer or croupier, I believe it's called, at a roulette wheel. And John is saying to the people playing, No more bets, please, ladies and gents. No more bets. Then John spins the wheel, and when it stops, one of the men yells out, 13! About bloody time I won! Then John looks at the man, and apparently he's doing some magic because he says, You didn't win. You lost. Try again. And then the man gets a blank stare on his face like his brain is rebooting or something, and he says, Yeah, I think I'll try again. Feeling lucky tonight. And as the man is saying this, it looks like John is pocketing a bunch of the chips that the man should have won. So John is stealing from these mafia casino guys. Then we cut to later that night after everybody's gone, and Archie says to John, You're pretty bloody good at this, John. You ever think of a career in the performing arts? And John answers, Not me, old son. Too shy. And we see a couple of the mafia guys start to walk towards John, and John says to Archie, Mind out, Arch. It's the Piranha Brothers. And then he turns to the mafia men and asks, What's the prognosis, Ron? Any hedgehogs on the horizon? And then one of the men punches John right in the face, and John screams, Ah, shit! And he falls on the ground, and he yells up to them, Listen, if it's about Kim, she said she was 18. And when John says 18, he gets kicked in the stomach by one of the goons. And then the man Ron that John was talking to that was in charge of these mafia guys kicks John again and says, Nobody steals from me, you little pile of dog shit. Nobody. Then we see the goons pick John up and they throw him in a storage closet. And then the men follow him in and close the door. And Archie's narration says, They'd caught John with his hand in the till. And the governor, Ronnie Watson his name was, well, let's just say he wasn't the type to let that sort of thing go. Like I said, John was very clever with that way of his. But I can remember thinking there was no way he was going to talk his way out of this one. So Archie's still standing in the room looking kind of worried over towards the door, and he asks the barman, God, that poor boy, Jerry. What do you think they'll do to him? And as Jerry cleans a glass, he says, Cut his balls off if he's lucky. Then Archie continues narrating, saying, For the next few minutes, you could hear all this banging and crashing and yelling and screaming from inside. Then suddenly, it all went quiet, and stayed that way. I must have waited nigh on 30 minutes before I dared look in. To this day, I've never forgotten what I saw in that room. And we see Archie opening the door, and as he looks in, we cut to what's inside, and we see Ronnie and his two goons are passed out on the ground. One of them has a big smile on his face, and a shirtless John who is tied to some pipes is kind of smiling at Archie, and he says, Watch your Arch. What news of our empire? Then we cut from that flashback to present where we see the older Archie has his finger in the mini guillotine, and he continues saying to us, "Mad, the lot of them, or dead. All that he needed was a couple of carefully chosen words." And then he looks from the mini guillotine into our eyes and says, "You see the horror of it all? Real magic is just the introduction of an idea, so that it eventually becomes a reality. It's just the smallest nudge, a suggestion, and when he says "and," he drops the little guillotine knife, and it cuts off his finger. And then a bunch of fake blood begins to spray out, and he says, "Oh my." And then he begins to laugh, and he says, oh God, I'm sorry. And then he pulls his hand out of the guillotine and shows us that he has all 5 of his fingers, and he says, "Look, you see, that whole thing about John, it was really a joke, a little misdirection. Got you though, eh? Here, let me show you how it's done." Then we hear John from behind us say to us, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Then John rushes over and gets in between us and Archie, and he puts a finger in Archie's face and says, "You grotty little Arab, I leave you alone for 2 bloody minutes. If I wasn't such a nice bloke, I fucking swear." And then John turns to us and says, "And you, were you born yesterday?" And we see Archie in the background is kind of pulling on his hair, and he's saying, "Sorry, I'm really sorry, wasn't..." But we focus back on John as he points to a shelf that has a bunch of jars on it, and inside the jars we see a bunch of fingers and hands and even like a fetus or something. And John points to one of the hands and says, "It's the oldest gag in the bloody book, and you almost fell for it. See?" And then we focus on the hand in the jar, and then we see Archie smile and give a little chuckle. And I'm not sure exactly what was going on here, but it seems like maybe Archie was going to cut off our hands or fingers if he was going to show us how to do it. Like, he was going to say, "Put your finger in the guillotine," and then when we did it, it would actually cut our finger off. So then we turn the page and we cut to outside again in the rain, and John is leading us on a sidewalk, and he's saying, "I said not to do anything stupid, didn't I? Christ." And then we see on the sidewalk in the distance, there's a man with an umbrella, and as we get closer to him, we see the man looks a lot like the first of the fallen. And as John passes him, he kind of holds up what looks like a newspaper or a pamphlet, and he says to John, "Hello, Constantine. Can I interest you in..." But he's cut off as John passes and says, "Fuck off." And then as we pass the first of the fallen, he turns to us and says, "Would you like one then?" And then John rushes in and grabs the man's papers and throws them on the ground and says, "Neither of us want one, you fucking tonk. Now piss off." Then we follow John away from the first of the fallen, but we do look back and he's saying, right. See you later." And then we get a close-up of the papers that are on the ground, and they say, "The Witness" on the top, so that's its title. And then underneath, the headline says, "Do you know where you're going?" So for some reason, the first of the fallen in this reality, or whatever this is handing out religious pamphlets. Then we turn the page, and we're following John into an alley, and there's a door in it, and John knocks on it, and someone answers, and John says, "Hello, Boz. This is a friend of mine. We'll be in for just a minute, all right?" And as Boz gives us a once-over, he says, "No problem, John." Then we get inside the room, and we see there's a man sitting with a headset, and he's watching a bunch of TVs, and he's saying, "Ha, nice one, Rev. That's one for the scrapbook. Okay, moving on. Gullible housewife at 5 o'clock. Then the man notices us, and he covers the microphone that's on his headset, and he turns to John, and John hands him something, and he says, "Here you are, Tony. Can you do these for me tomorrow at Haydock? Usual deal." And Tony answers, "No problem, John. Hang on a sec, okay?" Then he goes back to talking on his headset and looking at the monitors, and we can see the monitors now, and Tony is watching some sort of church service going on, and it looks like there's a faith healer walking around the audience, and that is who he is talking to. So Tony says to the man, "Yeah, boss, just to your right. The fat cow in the blue coat. That's it. Her name's Tanya. Trying to lose weight. Dad died of cancer last year." Then on the screen, we see the faith healer turn to the woman to his right, and he says, "And I have a message for you, Tanya. Your dad says he's not hurting now. He'll always love you just the way you are." And the woman exclaims with joy, "Oh!" Then Tony looks over at us, and he says, "Brought a mate, eh? What do you think of this setup then?" And then John looks at us as he smokes a cigarette. And then Tony kind of moves aside so we can see his control board. And he says, "Look, see? The power of God at me fingertips. I'm your psychic connection to the dead, like." Then the man Boz, who let us in the door, begins to laugh and says, "Ha ha, it's a bit of a lark, really. Matter of fact, It was Constantine who got us up and running years ago. This is all legal in America, like. I'm telling you, we've got it down. All we do is put on a disguise, go outside before the show, and press the poor old sods for information. I mean, people in pain can never keep their bloody suffering to themselves, can they? And then Boz holds up a dress with a bunch of flowers on it, and he shows it to John and he says, Here, John, remember this little number? And John kind of chuckles to himself, and he says, Well, if you got the legs for it, I always say. And Boz replies, Did you ever tell the one about that old geezer up in Scunthorpe? Then we cut to a flashback of what happened in Scunthorpe, and we see there is a preacher once again who's on stage in front of a congregation, and Boz narrates, Back in the 80s, right? He was up there on a holy mission, trying to cure people of their wallets. And I believe here he's talking about the preacher because it's the same preacher that we saw before, except of course he's younger. And we do see John in the audience, but he's in some sort of military uniform, and Boz's narration continues. So one night, John's out in the crowd as this paraplegic Falklands hero, and we see the preacher is saying to the congregation, I'm here in the name Harry Tyler, injured in service of his country. Are you here, Harry? And just as John was about to answer, some old man in front of him who has a walker says, Oh, that's me, praise Jesus. And we see Boz, who's standing next to John in the aisle, says, Oh shit. Then his narration continues saying, I mean, what are the chances, eh? So now we're scrambling like. The Reverend's either got to think of something or make this bloke walk again. And we see the Reverend turning to a man on the side of the stage who's behind a curtain, and he's saying under his breath, Tony, what the hell happened? And just when it looks like maybe their whole scam is going to collapse, Boz turns to us and says, No problem though. I mean, in this business you might get the occasional balls up, but you've always got a contingency plan. All you do is take away the old codger's walking frame, watch him fall on his arse, and claim he was overcome by the Holy Spirit. And we see that happening in the next panel where we see the Reverend taking the walker away from the old man who is on stage now, and Boz narrates, Only problem was, he never fell over. And we see the old man is kind of raising his hands up like he's been healed and it's a miracle. And then the man runs off the stage, very excited, yelling, A miracle! A miracle! And the Reverend behind him on the stage is kind of raising his hands like he's praising God, but we see Boz has a look of shock on his face, and Boz narrates, Fucking brilliant it was. First time I ever seen the Reverend completely at loss for words. Then we cut back to the room in the present, and John turns to us and says, Lies, bluster, and bullshit. If they could bottle it up, some big chemical company'd make a killing. Then John stands up and begins to walk towards us, and he says, Oh well, enough of this idle banter. You coming? And as we follow John out of the room, we see the TV screen, and the Reverend is helping an old woman stand up from her wheelchair. And as he holds her hands and pulls her up, he says, You will walk again, Gladys. Rise and be full of his power. Praise Jesus. So we walk back into the alley, and it's still raining, and John puts his hand out to feel the drops, and he says, Never bloody stops. And then he turns to us and says, Look, Chaz is supposed to be here in a minute. He's giving us a ride over to Stratham. And then he begins to walk over to a corner store, and he says to us without turning, You wait here for him, all right? I'll just nip indoors and get some fags. So as John goes to buy cigarettes, someone says to us, Psst, over here. And as we look around to see where that voice came from, we see a sign that says the Elephant's Graveyard. And then someone says, No, down here. So we follow the voice down, and we see Gaz, John's friend from issues 1 and 2 of Hellblazer, standing in front of us, and as he itches his chest, he says, Come on, hurry, before he gets back. And he's beckoning us inside of a pub, it looks like. So we follow him into a crowded room, and Gaz is saying to us, Come on, Christ. Then we kind of stop in the center, and everybody in the room turns to us, and we can see all their faces, and everybody who's here is everybody that's died in the comic so far. We see John's dad, Astra, Gaz, of course, who's leading us. There's Rick the Vic, Frank, Heather, Nigel, Brendan. And Gaz looks at us nervously and says, Look, you're the only one who can do anything. You've got to help us out, all right? Then Nigel, the anarcho-communist friend of John who died in the Garth Ennis run, runs up to us and says, Oh, are you the one from the pub? Listen, did anyone ask for me, like? Then Heather behind him says, Course not, you soft fuck. You're dead. Then Gaz pops up between us and Nigel and says, You've got to listen to us. Get something done about him before he sends more people in here. And Nigel adds, He killed me, all of us, and he'll do it again. And then Brendan walks up and cuts Nigel off and mockingly says, Sure, you're the same fella reckons JFK and Martin Luther King was one and the same person, mind. And Nigel fires back, hey, they could have been all right. The facts bear it out. And Brendan says, oh, aye. Yous never saw the two of them in the same room at parties like. But before Nigel can say anything back to that, John's dad comes in between us and Brendan, and he says, when you see that little bastard, you tell him this from me. He was never my son. Never. Then he storms off, and we see behind him at the bar, the bartender is actually Death from the comic book Sandman. And as she pulls on a tap to fill a beer, she says, they do carry on, don't they? And then we approach the bar, and she continues saying, don't worry about this lot. They can get a bit funny sometimes. Probably best you move along, Then Death picks up a bell, and she begins to ring it, and she yells out, time, please, ladies and gentlemen. Hurry up, please, it's time. And as we leave the pub, right before we get out of the door, Gaz points at us and says, wait, you can't leave yet. You've got to make sure people know, okay? He's a tricky one, Constantine is. He's not to be trusted. And then we walk out of the door and back into the rain, and we see John is kind of waiting just outside the door, and he looks at us and says, fun crowd, eh? And then he turns away and begins to walk down the sidewalk again and says, yeah, well, I wouldn't pay too much attention to their bleeding verbal diarrhea if I was you. Ungrateful bastards. Then we see Chaz pull up in his taxi, and he says to John, oi! And as John gets in the passenger side, Chaz looks at us and smiles and says, I thought you'd be down at the Boozer. Don't tell me. He couldn't come up with any coddle swap this month? And then as we get in the back seats, Chaz looks at John but continues talking to us saying, personally, I don't know how you can handle listening to all that bloody tripe John comes up with. Half of it never happened, you know? And as John lights a cigarette, he says, not true, my dear Charles. I just colored the truth a bit, that's all. And Chaz laughs and looks back at us and says, ha! Would you bloody listen to that? Gloss over, more like. I mean, I bet he's conveniently colored the truth about my Uncle Dave's haunted house, hasn't he? And we get another flashback where Chaz is hanging out with John, and they're walking to his uncle's house, and Chaz narrates, this is back after me mom snuffed it, right? The barristers was dividing up the property and all that, so I was supposed to get me Uncle Dave to sign some legal papers. The thing is, he used to frighten the tits off me when I was a kid. I mean, he was seriously deranged like. I used to think his house was haunted. John was all mouth and trousers as usual. All that weird shit he was into. Well, he'd seen it all before, hadn't he? And just as John and Chaz reach the door, it swings open and the uncle sticks his head out and he looks to the left of John and Chaz and he says, oh no, oh crikey, did you see anyone out there? And Chaz looks behind him and says, what? Who? And in the next panel, we zoom out and we see that the uncle is looking at a gnome in his grass and he says to Chaz, not you, Gordon. He's supposed to be watching the front door for Triffids, aren't you, Gordon? So apparently the uncle is talking to his lawn gnome, and as John looks at Chaz, Chaz kind of shrugs, and John says jokingly, runs in the family, does it? So the uncle turns and leaves the door open, and Chaz and John follow him in, and Chaz's narration continues saying, so we go in like, and Uncle Dave's talking to his bloody furniture, and I'm looking like a right twat at this point. Then we see Uncle Dave point to his coat rack as John and Chaz come in, and he says to it, take these gentlemen's hats, please, Norman, and turn on the protective force field till supper time, okay? And at this, John and Chaz kind of stop and stare at the coat rack, and Chaz's narration says, but then, it happened. The furniture started talking back. Then we see Chaz and John staring in astonishment as the coat rack answers the uncle saying, orders received and understood, Uncle Dave. Force field activated. And a very shocked Chaz says to John, fuck me, did you hear that? And John answers, I heard it. Christ. Then they walk into the living room of the house, and more of the furniture begins to talk around them, and Chaz's narration continues saying, and the house wasn't shy, mind. Before you know it, all the bloody chairs and tables were jabbering 10 to the dozen. We see a book on a table say, I don't like the look of him. And then a lamp says, hello, young Chaz. Who's your pretty friend? And the telephone also speaks, but I have no idea what it's saying. I think it's supposed to be like a Scottish phone, and the accent is so strongly written that I can't understand what it says, but I will try to read it. So it says, Jings, Begara, ach, aye, the new. See, I told you, it's hard to understand. So anyway, John walks over to the book that talked, and he picks it up, and Chaz asks, shit, what's going on? And John answers, local spirits, mate. They've leached into your uncle, and now they won't let him go. I've seen this sort of thing before. Then we cut to the uncle having already signed the papers and John and Chaz walking out and the uncle waving goodbye. And as John pulls out a cigarette to smoke, he says very confidently, "See, your uncle's a bit of a lost soul himself, so he acts as a conduit for dispossessed spirits. They're attracted to him without even knowing why. Take it from me, son. It's all standard stuff." And as John plays cool and lights his cigarette, Chaz sees something in front of them and he points and says, "I think you could be right, John. Christ almighty, look at that, would you?" Then we see what he's pointing at, and it's a truck that says, "Uncle Dave Ventriloquist, Children's Parties a Specialty." And when John sees the van, he kind of looks up with egg on his face, and Chaz is laughing. Then we cut back to present, where Chaz is looking at us laughing and says, "Mystic Master of London's steamy underbelly, my arse. I mean, only Constantine could turn Uncle Dave into Day of the Bleeding Dead, gullible pillock." So if you didn't catch what happened there, Chaz played a trick on John and got his Uncle Dave the ventriloquist in on it to make John think that he was hot shit for knowing all this stuff about ghosts and possession. So once the story's over, John looks over at Chaz kind of annoyed and says, "Oh, Chuckles, you're such a wag." And Chaz jokes back, "1,000 apologies, oh great Constantine." Then Chaz pulls over and drops John and us off, and Chaz waves at us as we get out and he says, "I'll see you two down at the pub later, all right? If you don't get abducted by space aliens or something." Then Chaz drives off, and as we walk up to John's door, John gets out a key and he says to us, "Poor bastard. Doesn't have a bloody clue what's really going on, does he? We just have to stop off here for a minute, all right?" So we follow John in through the door, and we go into the kitchen where we see Danny is sitting at the table and she's writing on her computer, and John says to her, "Oi, I brought a mate by, all right, Danny? Just need to take a piss." So John leaves the kitchen to go to the bathroom, and Danny turns to us and says, "Oh, hi. So you two decided to come out for a change. I didn't expect any company. Make yourself at home, okay?" And we see on the table next to her, there are actual issues of Hellblazer. So one of them is one of the recent ones we just read where King Arthur is kissing John. And the other one is the one with the gnarled hands that are holding the bloody heart. And that's the one where Danny's ex-boyfriend was stalking her. So it seems that this is Earth Prime or something. Like, if you don't know, Earth Prime, I believe, is our Earth, like reality. And I believe the DC universe is Earth 1. And from what I'm understanding here, all of the stories from the comics we've read are just actual comics in this reality. Then we turn the page and we cut to another room in the flat where Danny is showing us a dollhouse she has. And as she peeks through one of the windows, she says, "Do you like them? I do them as a sort of hobby. I've been on this one for about a year. John's helping me, you know?" And I should mention that in between all the talking of Danny or the other characters, it seems like we must be answering back, but we don't see what we say. But we must have looked at her questioningly because she pulls out a little chair from the dollhouse and says, "Oh yeah, he's marvelous with his hands. He'd never admit to it, but he made me this lovely chair out of matchboxes." Then John says from behind her, "You finished then, love?" And then John walks out of the room. And as we're about to follow, she looks at us like she got caught saying something she shouldn't have. And she says, "Oops, sorry." Then we turn the page and we're back out on the street where it's pouring rain still. And John turns to us as he lights a cigarette and says, 20 quid and you didn't see that, all right? I've got a carefully constructed public persona to think about." Then he begins to walk across the street to a wooded area, and he says, "Down here. Mind you, don't tread on any of the discarded needles. A lot of skagheads out on the common after school turf's out." Then as we walk into the wooded area, all of a sudden the trees get way greener and the rain stops, and John finishes his thoughts on people doing heroin saying, "Stupid little bastards. They've got no sodden gumption these days, have they? I mean, what's the bleeding point of creating a different reality for yourself if you've got no other reality to compare it to?" And he's saying that as he motions to the green trees that have just, like I said, gotten greener, and the rain has stopped, and it looks like we have somehow traveled down the path to Abaton. And we're seeing butterflies and unicorns walking through the woods, and John continues saying, "I mean, you spend your whole life in a fucking drug-addled stupor, and you lose all sodden ambition, don't you? Can't even see what's right under their bloody noses. Isn't that right, Jack?" Then kind of from out of nowhere, Jack of the Green pops up and says, "Hi, John, it is." And then Jack turns to us and says, "'Tis no place for you ahead, and this your friend Constantine knows full well. Turn back." And then all of a sudden, all the trees become gray again like reality, and John says to the disappearing Jack, "Up yours, radish bollocks." And then he continues walking through the woods and asks us, "You coming then?" So we follow him further, and he turns to us as we get to what looks like an abandoned house, and he says, "Through here. Keep it quiet, and stay in my bloody sight from here on out, all right?" And as they get to the front door of this place, he lights a cigarette and looks at us and says, "Look, you must have worked out by now what's going on. This is what I brought you here for. Just don't screw it up like you did at Archie's, all right? Keep stoom and watch carefully." Then we enter the house, and we follow John up the stairs, and he whispers, "It's up here, and don't tread on the brown stuff." Then we get to a door on the second floor that has a pentagram on it with a bunch of sigils, and as John opens the door, he reveals a woman shackled to a bed, and she sees John, and then she sees us, and she pleads to us, saying, "Please, you've got to help me." Then we see John walk over to the nightstand very nonchalantly, and he picks up a can of cat food, and the woman continues to beg, saying, "Constantine's going to kill me. He said so." But John turns and looks at her, and then he says to us behind him, "Chloe here thinks she's possessed by a demon. A really stupid one who owes me a few favors. Silly cow. There's no such thing as demons, is there, Chloe?" But as John says this, Chloe begins to kind of struggle even harder, and she breathes and says, "You haven't heard, Constantine? Everyone has their own personal demons." And then John casually lights a cigarette and says, "Of course they do. Only not quite as shaky as yours." And Chloe screams back, "1 million times! An eternity! You will offer me recompense for this ignominy!" Then John opens up the can of cat food and he puts it on a plate with a fork. And as he does that, he says, "Shut up and eat, you filthy shitbag. I only keep you alive because you owe me. And don't you forget it." And then John turns to us and says, "Nothing to worry about. Chloe's a bit soft, really. The demon's probably a figment of her paranoia. She likes to scream and shout to make herself feel important." And this, of course, angers her even more. And as he's about to shove cat food in her mouth, she yells out to us, "Don't listen to this one. He'd lie to his mother. Was she not already gutted by his squirming and kicking? His story is but a lie." And as the cat food goes into her mouth, she instantly begins to eat it up. And John says, Yeah, that's a line from The Exorcist, isn't it?" But once again, this seems to anger Chloe, and she begins to vomit up the cat food she just ate. And it also looks like, I don't know, her skin is being pushed out like if there's a demon trying to escape her body. And she screams, "Do we smell the sweaty brow of an interfering little wide boy whose self-inflicted stupidity cannot keep him away? Addicted is he to his minimal puissance? He has us for but a few brief moments, and yet he knows the consequences will last an eternity. Perhaps this is why he keeps us here, to prove his worth to his oh-so-innocent companion." And as she says companion, we see this pink kind of energy coming off of her, and a silhouetted hand begins to reach from her stomach that kind of looks like she's become a portal or something. And as the energy grows, John turns to us and says, "Fuck, quick, get out of here. Move it, move." And as we follow John down the stairs, we hear the demon scream out, "Constantine!" Then we turn the page and we cut back to the pub that we started at, and we see Rich and Muppet and a bunch of other people from the comics. There's even King Arthur who's talking to Rich, and John is looking at us with a pint in his hand and he says, "Okay, I probably shouldn't have taken you there. That was stupid. I just, instead of telling you all this bollocks every month, I wanted to show it to you. Hence the magical mystery tour." And then John gets serious and he continues saying, "Because you get to thinking, don't you? About the point of it all, like, where do you fit into it all? Take this place, for example. In here, even the daftest fishtail seems feasible." And as John says this, he looks over to Rich talking to King Arthur, which is, of course, illustrating his point. And as John pulls out a cigarette and begins to light it, he continues saying, "It's almost too good to be true. The perfect blend of beer and banter and bullshit. As if it was written that way or something." And as John says this, we do see Sean Phillips once again come into the panel and get another beer, and then walk back out almost like he's winking to the reader. And John continues, "What you saw outside today, Arch and Chloe and all that, what are you supposed to make of all that, eh? I mean, my world's all about magic and lies and old mates with shady pasts, but who's to say any of it's real? Or me, for that matter? Am I simply this, black lines on white paper, an iconic representation of an idea?" And when John says this, His panel goes black and white, and we just see kind of a white silhouette in a black background to illustrate his points further. Then the color comes back to him, and he looks at us and says, "Or am I as real as you are? Maybe the real question isn't what is real and what's a lie. Maybe it's what is reality." And as he thinks on that for a second, it seems like he just kind of drops it and looks back at us and says, "Oh, well, you spent the better part of the last 10 years in here listening to my fishtales. So you already know the answer to that one, don't you?" And then John smiles at us and he holds up his glass and he says, "Reality is just a story that's taken on a life of its own. Cheers." And we see in the background as John says this, Sean Phillips is waving goodbye at us. And I believe that's because this is the last issue that Sean Phillips illustrates in the Paul Jenkins run of Hellblazer. So this was kind of like his last hoorah. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.